Welcome, welcome, welcome. You're listening to IBGR.Network, known as the International Business Growth Radio Network. I am here today with a guest I'm very excited to have on, and I'll tell you more about him in just a little bit. But welcome to the Lead Lean Show. I'm your host, Crystal Y. Davis. And on the Lead Lean Show, we talk about operations. We try to make operations sexy for our business owners, as well as for our executives that listen to the show. And today we're going to talk about one of the three pillars that I always talk about, right? It's process, it's people, and it's your infrastructure and systems that keep the gears of your business churning. And today we're going to talk about that important asset, people, with my special guest, Jamie Flinchbaugh, and we are actually on Zoom as well as on the air, and so we will be airing the video content a little bit later this week. So let me bring in Jamie. Jamie, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Crystal. Really good to see you and talk with you today.
Absolutely, I'm excited because let me tell you guys, Jamie has written several books. His first book and most popular is The Hitchhiker's Guide to Lean Lessons from the Road. But the book we're going to talk about today, it is powerful, okay? Very powerful. There are so many nuggets in here, so many nuggets. It's people solve problems. You all know I always talk about the joy that I have in solving problems. And so we're going to dive into this today. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about Jamie. All right. So Jamie Flinchbaugh, okay, make sure you get that right. He always jokes about if you can spell his last name right, you'll definitely find him on LinkedIn. So
Right.
right. And Jamie is the founder of JFlinch, and he is a purpose-driven leader. Right? He crafts effective and resilient organizations. I love that. If there was ever a time that organizations needed to practice resiliency, it is now, particularly those impacted by major supply chain issues. Jamie actually has helped over 300 companies. I was talking earlier before we got started about how I aspire to be where he is today. He doesn't have to go out and travel as much as I do, but I've got to earn my stripes. All right. And Jamie collaborates with leaders and their teams to bridge capability, strategy, and culture and system gaps. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today. What I love about this book, Jamie, is that you call out the gaps. You call out the things that nobody else is talking about as it relates to getting organizations on board with solving problems and engaging their people. And listen, he has worked with some major organizations, all right? Harley Davidson, Intel, Mars, Amazon. I could go on and on and on, but I want to bring in our guest, Jamie Flinchbaugh, to talk about this book, talk about what he hopes that people who read the book will get from it. So Jamie, let's just start out with an overview. Like, why did you want to write about this book? There are so many leadership books out there.
Yeah, and you know, and I do a lot of leadership coaching and things like that. And I probably could have just written a book that would be called, Jamie's Take on Leadership. Because while a lot of them have different titles, that's kind of the title, that should be the title on most books, is just this is somebody's different take. And I really did try to write about things that I didn't see people writing about and talking about enough, if at all. And it's the gaps that I see happening over and over again in organizations related to problem solving. And whether they have a formal problem solving tool and process and training and all that stuff, or they don't, right? They're all solving problems. So I wanted to write about the stuff that applied to anywhere on that spectrum, and not the stuff, again, that was already written about quite a bit.
Absolutely. And that's the other thing I love, is that you don't make this book so heavily focused on the type of methodology, right? But the fact that companies and organizations have problems day in and day out, despite manufacturing, whatever industry they're in, and it takes people coming together to solve those problems.
Yeah, and that's really, kind of the heart of this, certainly the heart of the title, right? It's the fact that the tools themselves, don't solve the problems. And if you go down from one organization to the next, some of them have different tools, but that never seems to be the difference maker. And you go look at the best problem solving organizations, they have the same tools that some of the worst problem solving organizations do. And so it really does come down to what the people do with that, whether they have tools or they don't. They're all solving problems, and so that's kind of my focus. But the reason the reason it has to be written about is that not enough people, not enough training is on anything but the tools. We just keep training on the tools over and over and over again, and that's not getting us to where we need to go.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. And I really like, how in this book you talk about how it's not just about the tools. I can recall when I was younger and learning about lean, and I was so heavily focused on the tool until one day I'll say probably maybe 5 years in, I had this epiphany that because I was focused so much on the tools, I was leaving people behind. I was trying to master the thing and not being cognizant that the people involved in the processes and were involved in solving the problem were actually the key to those tools being successful and sustainable.
Yeah, and I had similar epiphanies in my career. I was an engineer by education. Let's call myself a recovering engineer. We have a 12-step program, that actually an 11-step program. Engineers don't like to apologize, so we skip that step. But there's a phrase that was taught to me. I don't remember where I learned it, to be honest, but it was more important to be effective than right. And I really prided myself on being right. I want to be right all the time and get the right answer and solve the problem correctly and solve it better than other people. And it didn't matter. Right? It didn't matter whose idea it was. It mattered whether the problem was solved. And so implementation mattered, right? Sustainability mattered. And to do those things, you had to bring people along with you. Sitting there with an unimplemented idea that you think is brilliant is not very effective. And so that was part of my, understanding and overcoming that, adjusted my viewpoints on all of this work, really.
Right. So Jamie, one of the things that I see as I travel, and I'm sure you see the same, is that the level of change and the complexity of the problems that leaders are facing now is just tremendous. It's like anything that I have not seen in my lifetime. I've seen a lot of crisis operations, but this just seems to be ongoing, and it seems to be extremely quick, fast, and the level of unpredictability just seems to be at an all-time high. So before we jump into the meat of the book, can you talk a little bit about how you can relate maybe some of the things that you share in this book that will encourage leaders to learn these skills and to learn this approach, even though they're in the midst of a lot of really complex problems?
Yeah, so I'll share a couple of nuggets related to that. One is that these problems don't go away on their own, and you can wait for them to, but somebody else is working on overcoming them, and they're going to be the ones who win. And so I think, especially as we're here in 2022, whether it's staffing shortages or supply chain disruption, it's time to get past force du jour, we can't do anything about that, and do something about it, right? So that's sort of nugget number one. Second thing I'll say is that the best way to engage these problems is to break them down, is to understand. You take staffing as an issue. Well, there's inability to hire people. That's one problem to solve. There's people leaving. That's another problem to solve. There's how we leverage people while they're here. That's a different problem to solve. And that's just a high level breakdown. You get down further, and people leaving for other companies in the same industry is a different problem than people leaving your industry, right? So it's really hard to solve staffing shortages with one big swing of the bat. We have to break that problem down and understand all the contributing factors. Climate change, same thing. Supply chain disruptions, same thing. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, same thing. None of these have single solutions that you just, boom, you go implement. And then the last thing is that what's the future problems, right? We can spend a lot of time trying to predict what they are, but if we're really good at problem solving, we kind of don't have to, right? That doesn't mean we shouldn't try, right? It doesn't mean we shouldn't, there's actually companies that had pandemic on their risk management plan before 2020.
Right.
So it's not that we shouldn't look at where the potential failures are. That's a very proactive thing to do. But no matter what they are, if we as leaders and our organizations are good at engaged problem solving, with or without any tools, we will be more prepared for whatever the world throws at us in the future.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Now, one last point on that. What would you say to the leader that struggles? And I know we're going to talk a little bit later about the role of the leader, but what would you say to a leader that struggles giving up that control to engage their teams in solving problems?
Well, I'd say maybe be another therapeutic moment for myself, but that control is a myth. It's leaders don't want to give up their control, but that's because they believe they have it, and they don't, right? I think if the last couple of years have taught us anything, it's how much of things and outcomes we don't control, and so yeah, the idea, of course, we can. We can do our best. We can hang on to as many decisions as possible and try to, batten down the hatches for every problem. But the control is a myth. We don't have control, so we're not giving up control. In the end, we're learning to embrace the fact that we never had it.
Oh, Jamie, that is powerful. That's very powerful. Listen, folks, I told you it was going to be a good one. I've been excited like a kid in a candy store to have this conversation. And listen, we're going to take a quick break. You've been listening to IBGR.Network. Please make sure you come back for the second segment. All right. You're listening to Crystal Y. Davis on the Lead Lean Show. Welcome back. Welcome back. You're listening to IBGR.Network, known as the International Business Growth Radio Network. I am your host of today's show, the Lead Lean Show, and Crystal Y. Davis. Listen, I'm so excited to introduce my guest again, and welcome back. Welcome back. I have with me today Jamie Flinchbaugh. I've had the chance to really start to connect with Jamie over the pandemic, actually, last year and a half. And we discovered that we have a lot of akin in terms of coaching and serving people and serving leaders and helping leaders to drive more people-centered organizations. So welcome back, Jamie. You gave us so many nuggets. I was joking at the break. I was having a hard time keeping up with my own notes because I'm listening so intently. You shared some things about leaders before the break, about them having to accept, that the change that we're experiencing now, that is the way of life, and that it's important for them to get more comfortable breaking down problems, right? Just break it down to the element of which you can start to make some traction and see some change, right? And then the last thing is to think about the future problems. Now, this one is intriguing to me because I'm working with some folks that are experiencing crisis, and I'm trying to get them to think about their 3 to 5 year roadmap. And they look at me like, excuse me, I have enough energy just to focus on today. So, but it is so important, right, that they have that line of sight to future challenges, and that they have this kind of opportunity to live in today and think about the future and the strategy forward. So
Yeah, it's one, it's just being prepared for it. It's just
Yeah.
knowing that, a lot of the assumptions that your business is based on, whether it's your staffing or it's the market or it's the fact
Mhm.
that people go into a restaurant, right? It's whatever the assumptions that it's based on, those are just assumptions.
Yeah.
And those assumptions may cease to be true at any point in time. And so uh, the more responsive we are, notice it's different than reactive, right? Responsive is sort of an engagement with a problem.
Right.
The more we are responsive to problems and engage with them with eyes wide open and minds wide open, it's how much we come through, not whether they occur in the first place, but how much we come through them to the other side and at least gain back some control, right? We may only be able to control 5% of the outcome, but if we
Right.
focus on that part, we're much better off.
Right. No, I absolutely agree with that. I've been interviewing some supply chain leaders, and one of the things that I hear over and over, I ask them about the one thing that they're most concerned about. And what I hear is that, they want to avoid their people experiencing burnout.
Mhm.
All right. And we're just in just really challenging times. And so one of the things that I found extremely intriguing about the book, again, the title of the book, folks, is People Solve Problems. And one of the things, Jamie, that I found um, very, very intriguing is you identified a target condition for building coaches within organizations. And you suggest that companies can strive where every employee has access to a coach, is one degree of separation from a coach. And when I thought about this, I thought about and reflected on how in organizations, the essence of coaching, if you will, is reserved for typically emerging leaders and executive leaders. So I wanted to bring that conversation to the network, and really let's just dive more into this target condition. What does that look like? How is that? How can people attain it? I don't want to say is it achievable, because I believe it is,
Yeah,
right? I believe that leaders as a coach is absolutely feasible. And I
yeah,
use the word leaders, not managers.
right. I
Okay.
think when you slip into that, that's what you're doing. And the goal is that, we're not talking necessarily about career development. I think that's, mentoring in a lot of cases. So, but coaching is sometimes just about the problem in front of you. It's about developing that mindset. It's building the skill. It's having a thought partner sometimes. Um, we use the phrase, I want to think out loud. Well, yeah, that's a really useful thing to do. And if you don't, sometimes that's all the coach is even doing. It's just allowing you to think out loud instead of
Absolutely.
think just onto a piece of paper or into the wind. And so everyone should have access to it. The 1 degree of separation is about how far away removed is that access to a coach. And in most organizations, the coaches there's too few coaches. That's problem
Yes,
number one,
that's
but
problem
they're
number
too
one.
far removed from the people who need it, or they're concentrated in one place. And so 1 degree of separation could be on the organizational chart. It could be geography, right? Even if you have a large company with several buildings on the same campus, well, if there's not a coach in your building, you're probably not going to go walk across the parking lot to go find the other coach in another building. So
Right.
it's building, it's a shift. Every shift should have a coach. Now, the easiest way to achieve that, I always say that the easiest way to do the math on everyone's 1 degree separation is that every people manager is also a coach.
Right.
And if you get there, now you've already achieved that, right? Now you've achieved 1 degree of separation. It's not the only way to do it. And interestingly, I'll say work from home and remote working and all the variations that come with that has both introduced a new degree of separation, so less access to coaching, and when people were thoughtful and deliberate about it, removed a barrier, right? Because geography, geography is no longer a concern if the coaches are online. But again, if I have to go find them, set up a meeting, and and then wait for that meeting. Well, now I'm removed. And so, not to get too tactical, but to just create an example is I know one coach who sets up office hours. They set up a standing Teams meeting that everyone has the link to, and you can just show up, and there might be other people in there already getting coaching, but you wait your turn and then you get coaching. And it's how they've created 1 degree of separation removed from a coach, because everyone has access to the link for the coach's office hours. So we ultimately have to get tactical around how are the coaches and who are the coaches and how do you access them. But every problem should have at least 2 people involved in it, and ideally at least one owner and at least one coach. That's our target state.
No, I love that. There's so many nuggets in there. I have so many thoughts right now. What about, Jamie, those orgs? And I really like the coaching, the open hours. Like I've done that personally with the business coach, and they just have open hours. You can pop in. It may only be a 2-minute, 5-minute session, but you're able to get it out, have that conversation with someone else. And then the other thing that I found beautiful about that process is there might be other people in the room who can offer some advice or motivation, or just, hey, I've experienced that before. If you want to talk offline, etc. I think that's absolutely wonderful. And here's the other thought that popped up when you were talking. I love the show Billions. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it on Showtime. Okay, well, it's a long story, but this company, it's really just oh God, I'm struggling with my words here. The company, the hedge fund company. Okay. And they have a coach on site full time. She's a coach / counselor, and people go in there and they just lay on the couch, or they just, they're frustrated about a problem. And so she's available all the time. And it's how they actually hold people accountable to high performance. Right. So all of that is great. What about that organization that's still just struggling to make problems visible?
Well, I think, first of all, that can be, one of the roles of a coach. To your point of, even a hedge fund has a coach. There's a guy who's passed away now named Bill Campbell. If you read the book, The $1 Trillion Coach, he has that name because he coached Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt and at some point Jeff Bezos, and I mean, he coached people through big problems, but a part of his job was to help expose the problems, like tell them when they had a problem that they couldn't see. And so a coach can be part of that. But it's certainly even better when we can build our system to help make the problems more visible.
Yes.
First, whether it's our management systems or our processes or our metrics, right? All of those are elements of that to make the problems more self-evident, right? And so, as a lot of managers spend time, it's like, why are we spending so much time in this meeting? Well, because we want to review everything in case there's a problem. Well, if we would have just set a way to define when there's a problem, then we just wait for that to happen, and then we don't need a meeting to go looking for it, right? So the whole idea is, build your processes, build your systems, build your metrics so that problems become visible. And you still need a system to manage it. Where are we going to capture them, right? I call it the landscape architecture, but problem landscape, right? What's the landscape of all the problems? You're not going to solve all of them, but you're certainly not going to even engage in all of them, just to put it, lower the bar even more. But well, you kind of need to know what they are first. And you see an awful lot of managers in particular spend most of their time just going around looking for problems, because the problems don't come to them. They have to go to the problem. And that's a tremendously wasteful way to go about it.
No, absolutely. I love that. I love, adding or setting an expectation that part of the coach's role is to help the organization make those problems visible, help them be able to embed that into their processes and their their infrastructure. And, what we're going to speak in the next segment about the role of the leader and expand more on that. And it's when I reflect on what you shared, it really just takes us back to how people show up to behave on a daily basis, and not just about process metrics, performance, driven metrics, but what are the behaviors, the underlying behaviors that allow the culture to become more and more open to problem solving. Jamie, you're giving us so many nuggets, so many nuggets. I'm going to have to just go back through here and listen, be able to listen, right, without actually having to facilitate the conversation and interview you. Listen, folks, I told you this was going to be a good one. I'm super excited. Again, we're talking about Jamie Flinchbaugh's book, People Solve Problems, right? Who doesn't have problems, right? Your organizations might be having more complex problems now than you've ever experienced. We're going to take a short break. You're listening to the Lead Lean Show here on IBGR.Network. We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. Welcome back. For those of you on the radio, you're listening to IBGR.Network, known as the International Business Growth Radio Network, with yours truly, Crystal Y. Davis. And we're here today on the Lead Lean Show with a guest, an influencer, a leader in the lean community and in the leadership community, Jamie Flinchbaugh. I have admired him for years, read his material, utilized his principles and concepts. He's a purpose-driven leader. He believes in principle-based leadership and is very focused on helping executives to be able to get their teams to exhibit the behaviors that help the culture be able to make problems more visible and support those leaders in empowering, encouraging, educating, and equipping them to be able to solve problems with their teams, engaging everyone. So welcome back, Jamie.
Thanks, glad to be back.
This is a very rich conversation, and I've been looking forward to it. We just spent a lot of time. You and I both talk a lot about offline about coaching, and not just lean coaching, right? Not just talking about lean tools or any methodologies, tools, but really just about how coaching is such a valuable tool to organizations and to leaders. And I like how you demystified a lot of the coaching elements in the previous conversation, right? And you challenged people to be deliberately intentional about removing those boundaries that keep everyone from having access to a coach. I think that is so powerful. And it was one of the things that just really resonated with me in the book. And I've actually taken some of these nuggets already and talked to leaders about how they can make coaching more accessible, because they tell their managers, I want my managers coaching more. And I'm like, well, have you looked at their calendar lately?
Right.
They're double or triple booked. When do they have time? Mm-hmm. Right? And when do you have time to coach them? So it's extremely valuable for organizations to have coaches. Now, in this segment, I wanted to make the shift, and we started down the path at the end of the last segment, but the role of the leader, I want to get more into that, because I can tell you honestly, when I was younger, I blamed the leader a lot for not being quote unquote engaged or bought in. And as I matured in my career, I started to see all of the balls that they were juggling and the things that they were doing, and that, they're not bad people. Mm-hmm. The infamous they, right? When you're not at that level and you can't see, you refer to them as they, should be doing this and that. And so I found it very intriguing, a lot of the ways that you break down the role of the leader, particularly around being the architect, right? So I want to dive into that a little bit. And I want to make this conversation as, the only word that comes to mind is empathetic as possible to all that leaders are going through. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, and I think that's an important starting point, because it's easy to assume management in general, right? They in
Yes,
general
they.
is just bad people, and most of them have good intentions, but they struggle because they don't have all the skills they need to be the
Mm,
kind of leader that we need, and they don't have the right systems, methods of work, and underlying systems. I'm actually preparing an article about management systems being one of the solutions to micromanagement, which is a
mm,
common reason that people leave their companies. But um, yeah, there's bad intention managers that those exist. I've worked for some in the past, but that's not the major problem.
that's not
Right?
the
The
major
major
problem.
problem is well-intentioned leaders can't do what they need to do. Um, so I believe this starts with a system. What is our system of work? How do we manage the landscape of problems? How do we get the right help to the right problems? How do we decide which problem we're going to engage in next? How do we get the coaches to the problem solvers? All of that stuff has to happen in a systemic way as part of our regular work. And and this is, this is one of the things that I think a lot of the book came out of the things that I've been coaching over the years. But this is one of the points that I think became much more clear for me as I was researching and writing. And that is that all context is local,
Mm,
meaning no matter how much we develop a company system, right? This is how we measure things. This is what the meetings are. This is what the roles are. That no matter what you do at an individual manager level or a manager of managers level, you have local context that still requires you to architect your system. Now, you might have 80% of it designed for you, you might have 5% of it designed for you, but there's always, you have to take responsibility for that. Just take an example of something that's supposed to be templated. You go to one McDonald's, you go to a different McDonald's, right? It's all supposed to be driven from, all the
yes.
standards, the handbooks, everything. They should be exactly the same. But you have one that, is has lots of late night, college kids because of where it's located, and has high turnover, lots of new employees. And you have another one that's a drive-by, on your way home from work, and has lots of tenured employees. Well, your environment of problems is different.
Yes.
And so you're managing those two identical McDonald's, and you still have to go, okay, I've got low tenured employees and lots of variation at a different time of day than I do over here. I have to manage that differently. And so every manager has to take some ownership for their architecting their system, making sure the system is working for them and for their team.
Right. So Jamie, with that, using that example, what responsibility then does the executive leadership, or the leadership that's responsible, say, for more of a regional approach or a business unit approach, how do they leave space for the local context, and how that may or may not influence, key performance indicators, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't write about that in the book. So let's explore that. I think first it's give them as much of a blueprint as possible. Right, here's
Okay.
the basic template. Here's our system. Here's how we want it to work. Then you kind of, for the stuff that you can't set at an organizational wide level, you create a menu or create a bit of a recipe that someone can adjust to taste,
Right.
the recipe analogy. And then, the last bit is the stuff that you can't fill in. You create the prompts, right? Here's the
Right.
question that you need to go answer, or you create the coaching to help someone answer it. Here's the stuff that we couldn't figure out, right? Here's the stuff that we couldn't make easy for you, but you still need to go figure it out. So do that. There's one organization I'm working with, for example, that is, they're struggling with a problem of how do we create enough time, right? There's never enough. Every organization struggles with this, by the way. It's not a new problem, but they're what they're trying to decide. Do we try to solve that at a company level, or do we try to give guidance and here's the menu of options, or do we
Right.
just try to create the prompt and say, make sure you answer this question. And every organization has to figure out where
Right.
where can they design, right? So the idea is at an executive or organizational level, you can never design the whole thing because again, all context is local. But you also don't want to leave it up to nothing, right?
Nothing.
Otherwise, you take a super worker, turn them into a supervisor, they have no system, they have no training, they have no guidance, and they're left holding the bag of chaos.
Yeah, as you were talking, a simple example that came to mind was the difference between two companies I worked at that were wanting to implement stand-up boards.
Mm-hmm.
And the one company, you absolutely everyone's board had to be exactly the same. And what I noticed was that the utilization of the board, engaging that in the stand-up process and solving problems, was not as effective because for a site where all the metrics were green, well, they said, well, we don't need to meet every day, or this doesn't really help us solve the problems that that are plaguing us right now.
Right.
Versus the organization that said, here are the guiding tenets
Mm-hmm.
that
Yep.
should be in place.
And so
Now,
you could say something like, hey, you've got to have a quality metric.
that's
If
right.
you don't know what it is, here's a list of options, right? So the guiding tenet is there has to be a quality metric for your
That's right.
work. And if you can't figure out one, here's some starting points. And if those don't work for you, go design your own. But there's degrees of ownership and design in there.
And that ownership, I saw that ownership at that low level and engagement higher where people had some say,
Yep,
right?
exactly.
And the other thing that I found was the people that had say actually eventually evolved to that standard, but it was through trial and error and what was plaguing the problem that they were attempting to solve at the moment, that freedom and that flexibility to have boundaries to work within, but to not be given a template that was so rigid that it was not effective.
Yeah, we tend to forget the learning journey that we've been on, right? And so we go on a learning
Yes,
journey. It's like, oh, this is what everybody should do, and then we just assume everybody else should know that. And some things we can just tell people. Other things they have to earn the knowledge for themselves. And I'm reminded, this is kind of a weird example, but I go back to the first Star Wars movie, and one day, Luke Skywalker's learning about the Force, and the next day he's telling Han Solo, "Oh, you don't believe in the Force? What's wrong with you? How do this thing I just heard of 24 hours ago, and you don't believe in it? I don't get that." Well, we have to understand that, like, just because we know something doesn't mean everybody else is going to believe that same thing. And there's something to allowing them to earn the knowledge for themselves.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that. Wow, we've run out of time on this segment. I was about to take us down a whole nother
Whole nother path.
a whole nother bag. So listen, folks, you have a treat before you today. If you are listening, make sure that you share this on demand. You tell other leaders that they need to come back and listen to this episode. I am having a ball. I have, so many questions. I know we can't fit all into one interview, but I'm super excited to have Jamie Flinchbaugh here today. And we're talking about his new book, People Solve Problems. So make sure you go out and get it. We're going to tell you in the next segment where you can find it. I'm sure you can find it, all over the place and on Amazon. But listen, you've been listening to IBGR.Network, the Lead Lean Show. We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back. Welcome back. You are listening to IBGR.Network, known as the International Business Growth Radio Network. I'm your host, Crystal Y. Davis, here in the operations lane of the Lead Lean Show, and we're talking with Jamie Flinchbaugh. Jamie has given us so many nuggets, things for you to go back and really listen again and think about how you can implement some of these things in your organization. We left off talking about the role of the leader in the last segment, and I wanted to just finish a little bit of that where we talk about the leader's role in problem solving their problem solving process. And so, Jamie, I wanted to dive into this because oftentimes when I'm talking with leaders, they still need, people just feel like they need a roadmap or something to follow. And they never feel like or think, they may feel it, but they don't really think they can challenge it, improve it. And so this was another aspect that really stuck out to me, because I think as an architect, right, it's part of your responsibility to look at at how things are operating and be able to make an influence change there. So can you talk more about that as it relates to a leader's role?
Yeah, so I think first is most leaders tend to just solve their team's problems, right? So they got, that's usually where they came from, right? They're comfortable there, they were successful there. And so this is what I call the 25 problems myth, is that if I have 5 direct reports and each of them has 5 problems, that means I have 25 problems. Well,
Yes.
no, it's not what it means. They have 25 problems. But in those 25 problems and how the team engages in them is great insight into what's holding your team, your organization back. It could be thematic problems, or it could be how we, engage with problems at all. We're dealing with them too acutely and not dealing with a systemic problem. We're looking too much at process and not enough at behavior. We're looking too much at behavior and not enough at process. Whatever it is, right? We start looking at what's holding us back, and then that's not a problem that finds us. These are now problems that we have to articulate and say, now I want to go solve them. And so you kind of first say, well, if you don't, who else will? Well, no one. That's why this is the role of the leader, is they have to take on these problems. I was recently working with an organizational leadership team, and they have a problem solving template. They have a goal, or actually a requirement, of every manager solving one problem a month and going forward. And so but it wasn't happening. They were only hitting maybe 20-30% of that target.
Okay.
And so we worked together on problem solving, right, that problem. And we got down to a whole bunch of different things, simplified the template, gave people an easier starting point, added coaches. Now you shouldn't theoretically implement 5 things at once, because you don't know which one really made the difference, but looked at what was holding people back. And now they're doing 1 per week per manager.
Oh, I love it.
A dramatic 10, 20-fold increase in the overall uptake of problem solving. And because they looked at it and said, well, we can just insist harder, or we can look at what's in the way. And they put in their solutions, and now their problem solving is going great. And now they're looking at, okay, what's next? What are the patterns in the problem solving that we need to correct for? And then how do we tweak the tool, tweak the coaching, tweak the expectation, tweak the system, right? How do we solve the problem solving to get the next gap and go even further?
So this is why I really love this part. 2 things. One is, when I first read it, and it's not an exact match to the anecdote, but I thought about Mr. Yamada always talking about the bird's eye view, right? And part of the role of the leader is to get high enough where you can see, right, and see the steps and what's working with the steps, what's not working with the steps, and what improvements to make. But in this particular example, right, you had a leadership team that, had this requirement, if you will, yet it wasn't working effectively. And someone at least had the courage to say, hey, we need some help in reviewing, why we're not able to get this moving. But I want to take a step back before that, right? So before this person who had enough wherewithal to reach out and say, we need help, what were the characteristics, not specifically like to out your client, but what were some characteristics that you found common in why that team didn't say, hey, something about this is not right, or it's not motivating me to go after these problems?
Well, I think the number one thing was a sense of ownership of the system, right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, well, I don't own that. And when you look around, nobody owned it, right? Nobody owned the whole thing. They might, you own the template and I own the metric, but nobody really owned it. And so, it's kind of like email etiquette, right? There's no czar of email etiquette in most companies. So unless the leadership gets together and says, we're gonna set some standards and we're gonna insist on them, unless somebody decides that they're going to own it and make a change, it just continues to exist in the ether, right? In the
That's right.
in the space. And it's so easy to do that, right? You kind of go, well, somebody made it like that on purpose. And at some point, you kind of have to say, no, this is important. It's not working. And that's the problem. I can't just go solve these problems for everybody. If I really want to go further, I need to solve the systemic problem. And the bird's eye view is important to help see those, because you need some insight, right? It's not like you can just do some math and out pops the answer. You need that bird's eye view. You need some instinct and some insight to kind of figure out what thread to pull at. Is this a skill problem? Is this a system problem? Now, with a bird's eye view, I would argue is you either need an eagle eye, which means you can see the detail, right? You can see between two blades of grass from 100 feet up, or you got to swoop down to the ground level to get close enough to see what's really going on without taking that away from people, right? So you still need to understand the granular nitty gritty of what people struggle with if you're going to have that insight and figure out that you need to work on it and what thread you want to pull on to make a difference.
To make a difference. I love that. As you were talking, I thought about this story from my own profession. And I think it also takes not just having that person that has the insight and so on, but it also takes the courage of someone to speak up and say something about the process that nobody really owns, but is holding us hostage, needs to change. And I'll never forget, I was working with a sensei. This is kind of a lean story, but I was working with the sensei, and we had discovered, that we needed to take action on something. And I said, oh, why we have to do the value stream map? And he said, why? We know the problem. And I was like, no, but we have to do the value stream map.
Right.
And and it's again this level of maturity where I realize sometimes you can make things so rigid that when they don't make sense, it becomes a deterrent for people to even want to engage in the process and methodology, and you have to be very careful about that. So,
yep, exactly.
So I really like that. So Jamie, this has been excellent. I mean, I could ask so many more questions. I only touched on 2 parts, 1 chapter in 2 parts of the book. So folks, that just should tell you how meaty this material is. So you've got to go get this book. But I want to do a quick recap for people so that if they're listening and they're thinking about their own organization and how they might influence change, that they can identify 1 action to take away. So in this book, I decided that I wanted to lean on the coaching aspect and the role of the leader for a couple of reasons. Particularly in the lean space, we always talk about why lean fails. It fails because of the leader, blah, blah, blah. Well, if we're talking to a leader and we can recap just in those 2 areas, what would you tell them about coaching, and what would you tell them about understanding the role of the leader that they might go think about actioning?
Yeah, so about coaching, I would say just start. People think they have to master problem solving before they coach. Well, I don't know anybody who has mastered problem solving. I know people who think they have, but I don't think there's any such thing. And so just start. And if all you are is a thought partner to people, if you're paying attention to the how of problem solving, right? The how they approach it, how they think about it, how they engage with the problem, A, you will provide value to that person, and B, you will learn a lot about problem solving just by paying more attention to the process, the how, than the outcome, which is what that person you're coaching probably owns. So
Yes.
that would be my advice for any leader wanting to coach, or any person wanting to coach. For the role of leader, I think that, there's so many different places to start. What I would start just doing is just start making a log of problems that you become aware of, right? Whether you engage with them or don't engage with them, whether you own them yourself or somebody in your team owns them, just start making a log. And you don't need a 5-question template to do this. Just take the end of the week or the end of the month and look at the entire list. And insights will come out, right? They don't even have to be right. They just have to be directionally correct and a starting point, and then you build from there. So you look at, are all these problems super acute and reactive, or are all of them too big and things that we can't even touch and we're just sort of playing victim? Are all of them things people are crying out for help on, right? You start to notice some patterns, and that's a useful way to get going.
Awesome, Jamie. Listen, folks, Jamie, tell the people how they can reach you, because I know your phone's about to blow up.
Well, the easiest thing is JFlinch.com. It makes it easier than spelling my last name, but if they do want to spell Jamie Flinchbaugh, it's easy to find me on LinkedIn. I think I'm still the only one there.
You are. Thank you so much, Jamie, for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, this has been a treat for me, and I hope that you have taken take some of these nuggets and actually go and influence the change that you want to see in your organization. You've been listening to the Lead Lean Show with your host, Crystal Y. Davis, and my very special guest, Jamie Flinchbaugh, on International Business Growth Radio Network, and that is IBGR.Network. All right. We'll see you next Tuesday, same place, same time. Have a great week.